Welcome back to step 2 of the build of the FP1. So we've got the chassis out of the bag. Firstly, you can see there's a recessed groove for the rear pod ball and holder. This is to get the roll centre of the car as low as possible. So we've recessed the carbon chassis. You can also see this one is a nice shiny carbon. We're also going to be doing a matte version. A lot of our other cars that we do, oval racing and minis, we do a matte carbon as well, and people have pre-ordered this. They'll be due in early part of next week. So we've built the wings. So now we're going to attach them to the chassis. So the wing has a little nick in the front, just in front of the 2 bolts, where that neatly fits over the chassis to stop movement this way and this way. So lay that over the chassis and add the 2 M4 screws through the chassis. In the coming weeks we'll be supplying the wings with a brass insert, so you can actually screw your M4 screw through the chassis. Instead of using a nut on the top, the insert will be in the wing itself, so you're not going to need a nut on the top of the wing. One, I don't like the look, and 2, I think if we can eliminate having a nut poking through the top of the chassis, it's one less thing to worry about. If the inserts are already in the wing, job done. So that's the front wing on. The rear wing, as before, we have the adjustment. If you can see that, we've got 3 holes, so you can move the wing up and down. So lower, it's in the mid position at the moment, which is the center holes. So the wing then mounts to the back of the chassis with 2 M3s through the chassis and into the posts. These posts are exactly the same as the servo posts, so if you do happen to break a servo post, it's a very, very cheap part to replace, and we sell them in bags if need be. So that is the wing attached to the chassis. So we now have front rear wing fitted to the car. The next step is to add the rear pod assembly, which I'll put that chassis to one side. The rear pod parts come in a separate bag. You have the first part, which is the pod support. Now these come pre-glued. The pod ball is glued into a carbon fibre plate, which then the plate screws to the chassis. What this allows you to do, if this ball, which they do over time, wear, you can buy a new ball and plate and replace it. So plate goes into the recess, 2 M3x10 screws through the chassis, and we have some very nice black nylocks to go with the carbon look. If you can see this okay. So 2 nylocks on top. And that's that fixed to the chassis. Now, we have played around with roll centres on the car quite a bit over the summer months. Now, the higher you move the ball, you can see that, in very, very low grip conditions, we can play around with the height of this ball. So for indoor use, I don't know if you can see it, it's quite hard to focus on such a small part, and also it's shiny. So when we get through to the setup tips, I'll go over the positions of this ball, because it can be raised up higher in the chassis for certain track conditions. Okay, so on to building the pod. We have the aluminium pod sides with their inserts and bearings. So press the bearings and inserts into the pod side. Some of them are quite tight, so they should fit nice and flush into the pod side. Do that on both sides. For rubber tyres, we have it right up the top. If you sometimes these go in really easy and other times they don't, but that's popped in really well. You then have the rear base plate. In that you put the droop screw, which goes into the back, so it goes in with a little recess from the top, so that screws into there. Excuse the noise. Then that fits onto back 2 holes of the chassis, of the aluminium pod. There's 4 little M3s. Don't do them up tight at this moment, so I'll show you a little trick first of all. So just literally locate all of the screws in the rear of the pod. Like so. So we have all 4 of the rear ones in place. Don't tighten them up just yet. Then we have the front beam, lower front beam. Same again. Can only go one way. We have 2 holes one side and one the other. Pop that on. These are not countersunk, so they're just normal button heads on the front, because there's no need to countersunk the front one because it sits on top of the pod ball, so it's never going to touch the chassis. So for a little extra strength, we've left those the button head. So once that's thing, same again, don't tighten them up too tight just yet, so we can level the pod off. So that's the front and the back. You can see that. Then we take the support for the top. Again, 2 little button heads don't do them up too tight just yet. So before you tighten up all the screws on the pod, this is a little trick that I've done before. You loosen off the droop screw, so the droop screw is flush with the bottom. Put your pod on a flat surface, press down so it's nice and flat, and then do up the top 2 screws nice and tight. Don't over tighten because it's aluminium and we don't want to strip the threads out. Just tighten up those 2 screws, flip it over, and then go round and tighten the remaining 6 screws. So then your pod will be nice and square and you can move on to the next step. So that's the pod assembly completed. We then want to add the M3 by 25 through the rear hole in the chassis. There are 2 holes, but you want to be putting this screw through the furthest hole back. You can see that on the chassis. Then there is a small M3 nut which goes over the top. You can see. And locate that. Okay. Then you have to put an M3 button head. A washer goes underneath. And then that drops over the top of the screw at the back. Just notice something. To do this, you can either remove the rear wing or take the droop screw out to drop that over the top of that screw. Locate the front screw into the ball stud which is in the chassis. And then you can go back and put the droop screw back into the chassis. Excuse the noise again. It's only a first time. You can put a little bit of oil on the carbon and it stops that horrible noise. So that is the pod fitted. We have the black spring, which is we use as standard, a little spring collar which goes over the top, and an M3 which screws over the top. Okay. Don't worry about the side movement. When we put the side links on the car, then that will sort that little problem out. I shall be back shortly for step 3.